Gambling debts led a woman to take out 5 life insurance policies on family members. It wasn't until 3 of those people were dead before someone got suspicious. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome to the 12 Days of Crimelines. Today's episode is going to take us to Taiwan. I feel like this series has been about the limits of researching international cases, but this one brings up something that I actually see in many cases. There is way more information out there on the background of the perpetrator rather than the victims. While that happens in the English language media that I usually use all the time, I have a few more resources up my sleeve. I can find little snippets buried in the newspaper archives, which are physical newspapers that have been scanned in. Sometimes the snippet will just be about the victim scoring a goal in a high school sports game, and that tells me they played sports, and it also tells me where they went to school. I can find obituaries, which often give more details, even if it's a grandfather's obituary. In this case, though, when I'm searching in English, it's really hard to find those details. Googling people's names using the Chinese characters did help me find some good articles, but unfortunately, I still don't have much on the victims. So our case is going to not start with a victim. It's going to start with the perpetrator, who is Lin Yu-Ru. And her name has been transliterated to English as Uju sometimes. And all of the sources with all the different spellings are what I would consider equally as reliable. In reading up on it, though, I found an article by Andrea Wong, who has the same name as her middle name. She was just writing about names in general, not about this case, but she did write that this name actually sounds closer to Uru, and so that's what I'm going to go with. That was a very long explanation, but it does give you a little insight into the extra research I have to do when I do cover cases like this. I already know I'm mispronouncing the name because of my accent, but that's not really an excuse for not at least trying. Uru was born in 1981 to what has been described as a good family. She was very close with her sister in particular. However, their father died when they were young, and their mother had trouble making ends meet. After attending a vocational school, Uru and her sister both got jobs at what is called a cabaret club in a lot of the reporting, but it is commonly called a JD club. This is more like a hostess club where men can come in and have a young woman sit with them and drink and sing karaoke. Some establishments allow men to pay for other services that aren't actually legal in Taiwan, like strip dances or sexual acts. It seems like that was the type of club that Uru was working at. While working at the club, 19-year-old Uru met 18-year-old engineering student Leo Yu-Hong. His family was well known in the area for their profitable stinky tofu business. Now, I initially thought stinky tofu was a bad translation, but it's not. It's actually a pretty direct translation. You may be familiar with fermented tofu, and that's basically what this is, and it has a very strong odor. During their 5-year dating relationship, Uru got pregnant twice and terminated both pregnancies. There are conflicting reasons given for this. One is that both pregnancies were girls, and she knew she wouldn't be accepted into Yu-Hong's family unless she had a son. But the other reason given was that due to Yu-Hong's family's position in society, it would have very much been looked down on for her to continue the pregnancies unless she married him, and she did not want to marry him. These two stories paint Uru in 2 very different lights. One, an opportunistic social climber, and the other, a woman trying to stay away from entering a marriage she didn't want to be in. And that is how a lot of the reporting on this case goes, depending on the narrative being told. Uru and Yu-Hong continued dating until she got pregnant a 3rd time. She was warned that it wasn't safe for her future fertility to have another abortion, so the two decided to marry and have their son. Uru was 24 and Yu-Hong was 23. After they married, as is traditional, Uru left her family and moved in with her in-laws in central Taiwan, which was about 2 hours away from her family. There were a few things Uru had in common with her in-laws, and a big one was gambling. Gambling is illegal in Taiwan aside from state-run lottos, so they placed bets with illegal Mark VI lotteries, largely run by gangsters. Rather than buying a ticket for a chance to win like a regular lottery, they could place bets and even do so on credit. So Yu-Ru's gambling debts just piled up. Another thing Yu-Ru had in common, particularly with her mother-in-law, Chung Hui-chen, was a pattern of abuse in their marriages. Neither ever called the police, but there were medical records indicating that Hui-chen and Yu-Ru were seen many times for lacerations and bruises. They would be prescribed pain medication and sedative anti-anxiety medications, which Yu-Ru became addicted to. At 27, with a young child, Yu-Ru was addicted to these medications, financially dependent on an abusive husband and his abusive father, and over her head in debt. I'm not sure if these debts were all hers, or if they were hers and Wu-hang's together, or if they were the debts of his entire family, all acquired and counted up together. I would be surprised if they were only her debts because the reported amount is so high that I can't imagine any bookie letting her get that far behind by herself. It is reported widely that Yu-Ru and/or the family owed nearly 10 million new Taiwan dollars, which is over 300,000 US dollars. It became so bad that they were at risk of losing the family tofu business. As they faced the company going under, they learned that a regular customer had switched business to another manufacturer. Soon after this, the customer's shop was the victim of arson. Yu-Ru was a suspect, though I can't find if she was charged or not. There is also an article out there that I can't find additional sources for that the family's business was also the victim of an arson attack in August of 2008. And it's also suspected that Yu-Ru was behind it. I tried to find more information on this, but failed. What I specifically wanted to know was that if the insurance paid out for the fire, because a month after this arson allegedly happened, Yu-Ru had the idea to take out life insurance policies on her own mother and her mother-in-law. On November 10th, 2008, just 2 months after the policies were applied for, Yu-Ru went to visit her mother, 53-year-old Ho Yua-Yuen, 2 hours south of where she lived. While she was there, the two got into an argument, allegedly over Yu-Ru's gambling. Later that day, the son of Yua-Yuen's boyfriend came home and found her lying at the bottom of the stairs, having suffered a major head injury. He called for help, but it was too late. No one suspected anything was wrong, and it looked like she had simply tripped and fell, tumbling down the stairs. A freak and tragic set of circumstances. 8 days after Yua-Yuen's death, Yu-Ru made the life insurance claim, and about a month later, a check was deposited into her account for 5 million NT, which is 165,000 USD. In May of 2009, Yu-Ru's 47-year-old mother-in-law, Chung Hui-chen, got very sick at home after eating food that Yu-Ru had prepared. She was rushed to the hospital a bit after midnight, where she was treated for her symptoms and then sent home when she felt better. But Hui-chen got sick again soon after getting back home. That afternoon, she ended up going back to the hospital, where she was readmitted. Yu-Ru requested that Hui-chen get a single room, no roommate. Then Yu-Ru and her husband Wu-hang took turns spending time with her mother-in-law and time at home with their son. At 4 a.m. on May 28th, Yu-Ru showed up to sit with her mother-in-law for several hours so her husband could go home. 2 hours after getting there, Yu-Ru pushed the emergency alert button in the room and the doctors rushed in. There they found Hui-chen dead in the bed, and they were unable to resuscitate her. Shortly after that, Yu-Ru applied to collect a life insurance policy. This one was worth more than 7 million NT, and the insurance company began to investigate the claim, as was standard. Then Yu-Ru bought another insurance policy, this one for her 4-year-old son. But he wouldn't be the next to die. On June 25th, 2009, just a month after his mother's death, Wu-hang started getting very sick with stomach issues. He was admitted into the hospital. Yu-Ru stayed at his bedside until around 2:50 in the morning when she left to go home to rest. At 3:30 in the morning, a nurse went to check on Wu-hang and noticed that his IV fluids were discolored with a slight orange color, and his vital signs were worse than the last time she had checked on him. She removed the bag and replaced it with a new clear IV bag, and she moved his bed closer to the nurse's station so he could be carefully monitored. About an hour and a half later, Yu-Ru returned to the hospital and talked to the nurse about how Woo-hung was doing. Seemingly surprised, he was still hanging on. She asked if they could move him to a single room, but the nurse said no, possibly because she had some suspicions following that funny-colored IV.
Determination comes in many forms, but always starts with a Dunkin' Run. So take your medium or larger coffee in one hand and grab a $1 donut in the other. No matter how you run, Dunkin' Run. A $1 donut with any medium or larger coffee. Excludes specialty donuts and fancies. Price and participation may vary. Limited time offer. Terms apply.
92% of households that start the year with Peloton are still active a year later.
All because of a fancy bike?
It's not just a bike. Peloton makes treadmills too.
All treadmills are the same.
Our treadmills can adjust speed and incline automatically, so you never break your stride. Whether you're squeezing in a power walk or training for a marathon, Peloton can help you achieve your fitness goals. 92% stick with it. So can you. Try the Peloton Tread risk-free with a 30-day home trial. New members only. Not available in remote locations. See additional terms at onepeloton.com/home-trial.
At some point, the nurse was distracted with something else, and when she looked back over to Woo-hung, she saw Yu-Ru holding a syringe near the IV drip. She asked what she was doing, and Yu-Ru said that the IV seemed to be blocked, and she was trying to get the fluids to flow smoothly again. The syringe was thrown into the trash, where the nurse recovered it. Woo-hung recovered enough to be released from the hospital, but then he was readmitted weeks later, in July of 2009, complaining of the same symptoms. He was diagnosed with gastroenteritis, aka a severe stomach bug, and he was admitted to the hospital for fluids on July 17th. He was in the hospital for 2 days when Yu-Ru asked that he be moved to a single room, which the hospital was able to arrange. And once he was in a room by himself, well, with just his wife, his condition worsened. At 2 a.m. on July 20th, 2009, Woo-hung died of his illness. This time, Yu-Ru stood to collect 4.75 million new Taiwan dollars in insurance money. But she couldn't immediately collect because the death certificate was being delayed since the hospital requested an autopsy on Woo-hung, and they wouldn't be able to complete that until they got the results of the tox screen. Reportedly, Yu-Ru called multiple times asking for updates on the death certificate. At this point, Yu-Ru had collected on her mother's policy, and her mother-in-law's policy payout was still pending. Woo-hung's hadn't been filed just yet because she was waiting on that death certificate, and Yu-Ru was the beneficiary of 2 additional life insurance policies of people who were still, at that point, alive: her aunt and her 4-year-old son. Yu-Ru, while she was waiting on these big payouts, kept gambling, losing an additional $1.8 million, which would be about $60,000 in U.S. money. The autopsy results finally came in for Woo-hung, and he had died of acute methanol poisoning. Methanol is also known as wood alcohol. This did not immediately trigger a police investigation because methanol poisoning is considered a public health issue in Taiwan, particularly amid chronic consumers of bootleg wine. It was when Yu-Ru tried to make a claim on the insurance policy that the police were called, because the insurance company noticed how close together Woo-hung and his mother had died. It turned out that both Woo-hung and Wei-chen had medication in their system that they hadn't been prescribed, along with pesticides. In late January 2010, Yu-Ru sat down with the police, and over the course of the interview, she ended up confessing to poisoning her husband and her mother-in-law, as well as pushing her mother down the stairs. And this case immediately became a media front-page story. Yu-Ru was dubbed something that, according to Edward White with New Lens International, doesn't really translate into English. He said it's a name that's a mix between evil daughter-in-law and Black Widow. This coverage absolutely turned public opinion against Yu-Ru in spite of her recanting her confessions by the time of the trial. As for the first charge that she killed her mother, Yu-Ru said she only confessed because the investigators said they were going to implicate her sister in the crime if she didn't. She had made a calculated decision in the moment to confess in order to protect her sister from being falsely accused. With the death of her mother-in-law, Yu-Ru admitted that she did inject something into her IV, but it was on the orders of her husband, who was abusive. She didn't even know what it was. Yu-Ru took a polygraph, and she did pass on this point, though it was not admissible in court. Unlike in the US, in Taiwan, the court can decide to allow polygraphs in as evidence if they want. In this case, the polygraph was ruled unreliable, and I've not been able to find any source explaining what criteria is used to decide whether to allow the polygraph in or not. The impression I get is it's really up to the judge's discernment. When it came to the confession about killing her husband, Yu-Ru did stand by that confession, but she said that she did it because he was abusive. The confessions were allowed in at trial and were honestly the bulk of the case against Yu-Ru for the murders of her mother and her mother-in-law. Neither one had full autopsies done, and one death had been ruled accidental and the other natural. The death certificate said her mother-in-law died of a heart attack. There was, however, some independent evidence that Yu-Ru did kill her husband. They were able to test the IV drip bottle that he was given at the hospital, as well as the syringe, since the nurse saved it just in case. He had been drugged with sleeping pills and an insecticide, and then killed with methanol, and Yu-Ru was seen injecting stuff into the IV. But there is a little issue with this evidence. The nurse didn't call the police or turn the items over in July. It wasn't until 6 months later, when the insurance company alerted the police that these items were finally turned over to the police, taken from the hospital where they were stored. Except they weren't stored in evidence bags or isolated from other items. There was no chain of evidence. And then there were 2 different stories of where the syringe was from, making it possible that the syringe they had wasn't even the one Yu-Ru had used. In a lot of jurisdictions, this would be enough to toss that evidence out, but the judge allowed it in. In Taiwan, there are no juries, and instead everything is overseen by the judge. And the judge is generally the one who questions witnesses. Now, each side does offer up witnesses and evidence, but the judge has a very active role in the courtroom and a lot of power. They determine what is allowed in, what is talked about, and what is then considered fact. In this case, things went in favor of the prosecution on many points, and I'm not sure if that's part of the way the system is set up or if it's just this case. For instance, the prosecution was allowed to hand over their files to the judges months before the defense got to present any evidence or counter anything in those papers. The prosecution was also allowed to enter in evidence the life insurance policies for Yu-Ru's aunt and son, saying that she was planning to kill them next, even though there's no evidence of that other than the insurance policies. Basically, they relied on the policies to prove why they should allow the policies to be presented in court. Another issue at the trial was an expert who testified as to what was in Yu-Ru's mother-in-law's hospital records. He said it didn't appear that she died of an illness, but he couldn't completely rule it out. But the court, for some reason, ruled that this meant that he ruled out that this was a heart attack, making the death certificate wrong, which wasn't actually his testimony at all. So they ruled something as fact, used testimony that did not say that to support it, and now that is considered a finding of fact in this case. It doesn't seem to be any surprise that Yu-Ru was found guilty for all 3 murders, even though her uncorroborated and recanted confession was the sole evidence in the death of her mother. In Taiwan, confessions cannot be used as the only evidence to support a conviction, but the prosecution had successfully argued the insurance policies were evidence as well. She was then given life sentences for the murders of her mother and mother-in-law and a death sentence for killing her husband. Yu-Ru appealed based on her relatively low IQ and drug abuse, saying that this was evidence that she wasn't in her full faculties at the time of the murders and she should be at least spared a death sentence. From the end of her trial in 2011 to 2013, her appeals made their way through the system. In 2012, her death sentence was reduced to life in prison. However, the legal battle continued. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court, which rejected a lot of Yu-Ru's claims of low intelligence and mental illness. They said that her ability to run the family business, to apply for insurance policies and receive the payouts, and carry out multiple premeditated murders in a way that she nearly got away with them proved she was more intelligent than she claimed. It showed she functioned well enough that she should have known not to murder people. The Supreme Court then reinstated the death sentence. As of the last statement I could find on this case in 2013, Yu-Ru continued to deny that she killed her mother and her mother-in-law, only saying she killed her husband because he was abusive. There are a few reasons I wanted to cover this case. One is I find it always interesting to look into how other court systems do things, to see what we can take from that, what is good about it, and what we think is unfair, that we want to make sure that in our home jurisdictions, our courts and our laws are avoiding those things. I do think this case is one where Yu-Ru did not have a fair trial. That said, I also wanted to just kind of think about what happens when it's someone who we believe is guilty, because I absolutely believe she's guilty of at least 2 of these murders, if not all 3. What happens if someone who is guilty gets an unfair trial? It ends up being pretty hard to rally public support behind them, which is what actually changes outcomes. I also think it's just part of our own true crime, criminal justice moral code, our personal codes, how much effort we put into rallying behind people we think are guilty who were not treated fairly. Sometimes it's hard to muster that. As of today, late 2023, Lin Yu-Ru remains incarcerated. Like in the US, the likelihood she's put to death depends on who is in power. The carrying out of her sentence and truly whether or not she lives or dies depends largely on the next election cycle.